on? Yeah, it is, yes. If I'm starting a minute early because I want us to catch the coolest part of the day. And usually my friend and colleague Bob Spiritus does the opening introductions. He and his wife are recuperating and hopefully will be here in mid-July. But so let's just all wish them the best. My wife and I moved into a CCR this summer, or last summer. And one of the things that they do that was really shocking, they start every meeting exactly on time, and no meeting can last more than an hour, and people just get up and leave. And it is amazing how well that works. So don't feel bad if you feel that way. Today's talk will be introduced by Mark Wentzler, who's responsible for our cool air here as he's doing the non-existent climate change at Chautauqua. One of the things that I love about this talk is it's comparing partly the Old West and where we are. My wife and I grew up in Los Angeles, and when we started coming east, we thought Pittsburgh and Buffalo were the East. And then one day I was looking at football scores in the New York Times, and they had the University of Pittsburgh heading the Midwest scores. And that surprised me. Then when we started coming here, I realized that Buffalo was the end of the Midwest, as the grain and the meat and everything came through to Buffalo and then went to New York City. But the shocking thing, and something I would like to recommend all of you find a time to do, if you get off the grounds, if they let you and you escape for an afternoon, and you get to the fork in the road with Andriaccia's Pizza Place, turn left and go up the hill towards Stedman. At Stedman Corners, turn right towards Sherman. It's 20 minutes and you'll get to the town of Sherman, New York. You will think you're in Colorado. It is a western town with rodeos set up. It has wooden covered sidewalks. It is a movie scene out of Hollywood. And it's proof that we are in the Wild West here. So at the back of the hall are printed trifolds with our program for the whole year. It's going to be a wonderful and exciting year. One of the changes we've made is we found at the end of last year that Zoom just wasn't working very well. And so we have transferred our talks. They're now on YouTube, and you'll be able to find the old ones and the new ones on our web page, and you'll be able to watch them live. Not as live as for you all now, but on YouTube. And with that, Mark.
Thanks, Bob. And I really love partnering with you guys in the Chautauqua Science Group and the Western New York Land Conservancy. You guys have been back here every year since I've come to Chautauqua. I think it's the 4th or 5th year, and really excited to have you here. Josh, I want to introduce Josh, who's giving our talk today. So Josh Balisteri is the Stewardship Director of the Western New York Land Conservancy. He's a multidisciplinary ecologist and natural resource manager with over 7 years of experience as Stewardship Director. In this role, he oversees management and protection of conservation lands, specializing in nature preserve stewardship, conservation easement enforcement, public access planning, trail design and construction, and wildlife management and ecological restoration. Josh has led numerous large-scale conservation projects, designed and built sustainable trails, and developed innovative stewardship practices that have strengthened land protection efforts across the region. Josh holds a degree in natural resource management from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, with minors in recreation resource protection area management and forest resource management. And most importantly, when he's not stewarding landscapes or designing hiking trails, Josh spends his time exploring remote wilderness areas by backpack or canoe with his dog, River, as far away from light pollution, noise pollution, and cell coverage as possible. Amen. Welcome, Josh.
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Bob, and thanks to the Chautauqua Institute for having us. I know at the Land Conservancy, we're really excited to be here and come back every year to speak with you all. This is actually my first time at this beautiful place, so I was totally blown away last night. Mark and I were walking around. One of my favorite bands just happened to be playing outside the condo that I'm staying at, the Wood Brothers, so that was pretty crazy. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. Really excited to talk to you today about the Western Oak Land Conservancy and conservation lands management, kind of the science and philosophy behind the stewardship practices that we partake in at the Western York Land Conservancy. And I did want to just give a quick land acknowledgement here before I start. So the Land Conservancy recognizes that we serve on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Seneca, Tonawanda-Seneca, and Tuscarora nations and other indigenous communities. We are thankful for the Haudenosaunee who have been and continue to be the stewards of this land. We are committed to the Haudenosaunee seventh generation principle, which asks to honor the lessons of the last 7 generations as we work in partnership to shape and heal the world of the next 7 generations, that the next 7 generations will inherit. All right. And with that, we'll get into this science behind conservation lands management. So whenever I talk about stewardship or land management, I like to kind of set the stage first. What are we dealing with? So in my brain, as the stewardship director at the Western York Land Conservancy, my job is to manage all of our conservation land holdings. And that takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of conceptualization of what we're dealing with. And I think of all the litany of challenges we're facing in the environmental world right now as the environmental crisis. And then I kind of think of that as a war on 2 fronts. So there's climate change, which I know a lot of you here are familiar with. So weather patterns changing, species having to adapt to different temperature regimes, and then biodiversity loss. And those 2 things tend to exacerbate one another. So climate change very much exacerbates biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss can also exacerbate climate change. So those are the 2 broad things we're thinking about when we go to manage lands at the Western York Land Conservancy. And I think it's important to keep that biodiversity loss aspect of the environmental crisis in mind. So this graph on the screen shows in the red is habitat degradation. So habitat degradation is largely responsible for birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, fish, all the taxa on that graph. The main contributor to their decline is habitat degradation. And it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about the stewardship, because the stewardship practices that we implement at the Land Conservancy are really to help solve this biodiversity loss issue. So before we get into how we manage our conservation lands, just a quick primer on what a land trust is, who we are as the Western York Land Conservancy. So a land trust or land conservancy is a community-based nonprofit organization that actively works to permanently protect land. So when we're thinking about that biodiversity decline, in our opinion at the Land Conservancy, one of the most important things we can do in the face of biodiversity loss is permanent land protection. So that's what we do. And we protect land in a variety of ways. So we directly own properties. So we fundraise, purchase properties. We call those our nature preserves. Many of them are open to the public. They have hiking trails. You can visit them. A couple of our most beautiful nature preserves are here in Chautauqua County. So the College Lodge Forest is a beautiful old-growth remnant in Brockton. We have the Floating Fen Preserve as well, which we protected last year. And that's one of the coolest poor fen, really awesome wetland systems that we have in Brockton as well. It's right near College Lodge. So those are directly owned properties, and those are the properties that myself and my team are tasked with managing. We also protect land through conservation easements. We actually had our acquisitions director, Rachel, here last year. She was talking about our farmland protection program. So a lot of our farmland we protect through conservation easements. In short, conservation easements are a legal agreement that restricts certain uses on a property in order to protect its conservation values. So those are really important when we're protecting agricultural lands. And the important thing with those is private landowner retains ownership. It's not like our nature preserves where we own and manage them. The easements, a private landowner maintains ownership, and those conservation values are protected by the agreement. So our mission overall is we permanently protect land with significant conservation value in Western New York for the benefit of future generations. And then here's just a quick map of our protected properties. So these numbers are actually a little out of date. We just closed on a bunch of properties that we're really excited about. So we have over 24 nature preserves, over 61 conservation easements, and we actually just reached our mark of 8,000 acres of land protected, which we're all really excited about. So that's forests, farms, meadows, wetlands, all protected throughout our 8-county service area. You can see on the map, those are the 8 counties in which the Land Conservancy works. And we've got both those directly owned fee properties and conservation easements all over those 8 counties. And we're working on an additional 4,000 acres right now. Our acquisitions team, the folks that we work with that actually purchase properties, have this huge queue of really exciting projects that they're working on right now to protect. And then I'll briefly talk about the Western New York Wildway before we jump into the stewardship and conservation lands management science, just because it's so important, and I think it's one of the coolest things that we're doing. And actually, my colleague Marcus, our Western New York Wildway director, is giving a talk on the Western New York Wildway specifically later in the summer, so definitely come check that out. But our Western New York Wildway concept is this landscape scale conservation initiative that we're really excited about, and it's really designed to combat habitat fragmentation. So that biodiversity loss that we're keeping in mind as we're thinking about these stewardship practices. In Western New York specifically, we have a highly fragmented landscape. So there's a lot of forest, but there's also a lot of agriculture, developed land, and it creates these islands of habitat. And when habitats are in islands, it's very challenging for wildlife to move across our landscape, reproduce, adapt in the face of climate change, things like that. So the Wildway is really this big landscape scale framework that we use to decide where it's most important to protect lands. We have this environmental crisis. We need to be really efficient and tactful about where the lands are that are most important to protect. So the Wildway, we did a lot of really cool analyses, wildlife movement analysis, some camera trap studies that we just finished up, and it kind of, as well as some statistical and GIS mapping. That's all really cool and state-of-the-art, and the purpose of that was to identify these core areas, which are in green on this map. So those are the most pristine, intact habitats we have in Western New York right now. And then we also identified linkage best paths, so that's what's in dark blue on this map. And those linkage best paths are how wildlife would most likely get between these core islands of habitat. So how do they move from one green area to another? That's through these linkage best paths. So we want to expand on those core areas with our land protection, and we also want to protect land in those best path linkages so that wildlife can move between core habitat sections. In the face of climate change, especially north to south movement is super critical for wildlife. So I won't get too into the Wildway, but I did want to just mention it because I think it's really exciting and one of the most important things that we're doing right now. Okay, so we talked about how we protect land. So we have these conservation easements, we have these directly owned fee properties. So we protected the land, now what happens? In our opinion, it's not enough to just buy a piece of property and let it go. So what happens once we've purchased a property, especially those owned fee properties, is stewardship, and that's my job as the stewardship director. So stewardship's our ongoing promise to care for conserved land, monitoring, managing, restoring, and upholding the protections of that land forever. As a land trust, when we protect land, we manage it forever, so that has implications for our stewardship, and we really care about managing those lands properly. So as we get into how we do that, I'll talk about some of the modern challenges we're facing in land management and stewardship right now. So some of those are climate change, invasive plants, pathogens and disease, which are also often invasive, deer overabundance, and then we'll talk about kind of some of the impacts of recreation and how we use recreation ecology to address some of those challenges. And then we'll also talk about restoration ecology, which is kind of the art and science that we implement to solve some of these problems like invasive plants, pathogens, climate change. So invasive plants is the first challenge we'll talk about when it comes to land management. So we've protected a property, we have it in our possession now. How do we take care of it? And what do we find there? So when we get in the door and we're visiting a property for the first time that we protected, we need to figure out what's there. And unfortunately in Western New York, what's going to be there most of the time are these invasive plants. So invasive plants are one of the biggest threats to ecological health here in Western New York. And they're a really big problem. And what makes them a problem is they're non-native species, so they're usually accidentally or purposely brought here, a lot of times in the landscape trade in the 19th century. Some are more modern, but they're brought here usually from a different continent or another part of the world. They're often aggressive and opportunistic, so they like edge habitat and different, that fragmentation that we talked about really exacerbates how bad these invasive plants are, because there's all this edge and island that they take advantage of as opportunists. They often don't have natural predators, diseases, or herbivores to keep them in check. So because they're from a different continent, they co-evolved with a whole different suite of species. And what happens when you co-evolve with a whole different suite of species is that when you get to a new continent, you have no predators, diseases, pests, or pathogens that keep your populations in check. So these invasive plants have come to our Western New York region, and they have no predators, they have no herbivores. So they have this disproportionate impact on our ecosystems, and they can cause really, really big problems. So this means they can outcompete native plants, take over entire understories, dramatically reduce biodiversity. In some places we manage, you walk into a forest and see nothing but invasive plant stems. So we have a few properties like that where these monocultures of invasive shrubs will form. So buckthorn we'll talk about a little bit, and honeysuckle that are really problematic. They get into the understory of forests. And they're really challenging to deal with. So even though they might look harmless, sometimes even pretty, invasive plants are disrupting our ecosystems right now, and reversing that damage takes serious work and long-term commitment. So that's what we do in stewardship, is we try to manage this invasive plant challenge. So let's talk a little bit about these plants, because this is what we spend a lot of our time doing in the land management world, is dealing with these. So these guys here that we're about to talk about are kind of our primary offenders. They're what we see most of the time when we conserve land and we're doing our surveys. This is what we're seeing the most of. So that top left photo is a honeysuckle thicket. So these invasive shrubs, honeysuckle being one of them, they're what I talked about that form those monocultures where you often don't see another plant in the understory. They fully shade out all of our nice native herbaceous plants like spring ephemerals, nice flowers, all the rich understory plants you would normally find here. These invasive shrubs are going to come in, they're going to outcompete them for all those reasons we talked about, and then they shade them out. So honeysuckle's a really bad one we see a lot. Common and glossy buckthorn, particularly problematic, especially in the northern part of Western New York. Japanese barberry is a big challenge, so that is an invasive plant species that is distributed by birds. So anytime there's bird droppings, there's potential to have Japanese barberry in it. They feed on barberry fruit. So even in really intact systems like our College Lodge Forest here in Chautauqua County, we can have barberry pop up because of the way that they're distributed in an otherwise intact, mature forest. So multiflora rose is another invasive shrub we have a lot of issues with. That's a really nasty, it's a rose, so it has a hook-shaped thorn. Really nasty if you're hiking or bushwhacking. It's really, we don't like it, our field team. We have a lot of wounds from that one. Invasive forbs and vines are a whole nother category of these invasive plants that we deal with. So mugwort, I particularly don't like this one. That's in the bottom left corner. And that is a forb that likes to colonize our riparian zones, or our areas that are near water. So what riparian means. So creeks especially, they like the gravel bars on creeks. So you see mugwort a lot there. Riparian zones are critically important wildlife and plant habitat. So plants like mugwort, as well as Phragmites and Japanese knotweed that threaten our riparian zones are particularly something we like to keep an eye on and try to manage as much as we can. It's also, a lot of people are really allergic to mugwort, including myself, so it's not my favorite. Pale swallowwort, Japanese stiltgrass, lesser celandine, oriental bittersweet, Phragmites, Japanese knotweed, the list goes on. And these are all the invasive plant species that we have to deal with when we're managing these conservation properties, trying to get them back on a trajectory of quality habitat. There's lots of early detection species too. So these are kind of our primary offenders that we work with the most, but there's this whole other suite of what we call early detection invasive plant species and pathogens. So porcelainberry, slender false brome, Scotch brome, spotted lanternflies, one you might have heard of. These are all species that don't have their foot in the door as much as the ones on this list, so they're not as established in our region. And because of that, we want to keep a particular eye on them, because the best time to intervene with invasive plant species is when they're in that early detection phase, when they're not super populous. These invasive shrubs and the ones on this list here, they're already really well established, so the best we can do is really manage them, where some of these early detection species, Amur corktree, water lettuce, red swamp crayfish, other ones that we want to keep a special eye out because we can intervene in a much more impactful way if we catch them before they've really got a foothold here. So that's invasive plants. Another challenge we face in land management and stewardship is pests and pathogens. So these are also often invasive, and they affect forest health. So there's a lot of these that we deal with. And just like invasive plants, they're non-natives. They evolved also oftentimes elsewhere, so they also have that issue where there's not good checks and balances in our native ecosystem to manage them. Insects, fungi, bacteria, these are all pathogens. They often arrive with no natural predators. They spread fast, and they do long-term damage. So there's lots of these we're keeping our eyes on. The big one right now is hemlock woolly adelgid. That particularly affects our properties because we have a lot of hemlock northern hardwood forest here in Western New York. And it's particularly important in riparian areas, like some of those plants we talked about, because hemlocks really like shaded ravines, so they have an outsized impact on water quality. They create a lot of shade, they create trout and fish habitat, and they also provide good structure in those ravines and control erosion. Beech leaf disease is another one that we're concerned about, as well as beech bark disease. And we'll talk about hemlock woolly adelgid a bit as a case study when we talk about some of the solutions to these challenges. But beech leaf disease is another particularly concerning one of these pests and pathogens. Between beech bark disease and beech leaf disease, they're together decimating one of our most common forest trees, and that's American beech. So historically, American beech was one of our most populous trees here in Western New York. It's what we call a climax species. So historically, in the mature forest, before most of the state was cleared for agriculture in the early 19th century, American beech was one of our climax trees with sugar maple and hemlock. So it's a really long-lived, shade-tolerant species. So it's what you would find in those ancient forests, which makes it really important. What's also important about it is it creates beech nuts. So these beech nuts are one of the most densely caloric and important food sources for wildlife in our Western New York forest. So what's happening between this beech leaf disease, which you can see in photo number 2 there on the bottom left, that defoliates beech, and then beech bark disease, it's almost impossible to find a perfectly smooth beech anymore in Western New York. So historically, a beech is a completely beautiful smooth bark tree, but any beech you see right now is going to be dimpled and cracked from this beech bark disease. So between the two of those, beech aren't reaching a maturity age where they produce their beech nuts and this mast that's really critical caloric food for wildlife in our forests. And we've already lost other important species like ash, the American chestnut, all densely caloric nuts. So we're missing another really key component of our food web for wildlife. So when we talk about these invasive pests and pathogens, you're not only losing the direct species being affected, but all the complex interactions that species affects are being affected too. So wildlife in particular is really suffering from beech bark disease. Emerald ash borer is one most of you've probably heard of. So that is a beetle that creates these galleys that you see in that bottom right photo. And it has created 99% mortality in most of our forests throughout Western New York for ash trees. So it's very, very challenging to find an ash tree that is fully healthy right now. You can inoculate them if you have them on your properties, and that's some of the only ones left. There are cases of resistant ones, but 99% mortality is really significant. And this is a species, ash by itself and emerald ash borer is something we don't spend a lot of time managing at the Land Conservancy because that invasion line has already swept through and killed all the ash. But what we're dealing with in the wake of that is it's caused a lot of change in the ecological dynamics of our forest because ash was a really predominant canopy tree and it created all these gaps when it died with this big invasion that swept through the state. Whenever you create gaps, remember those opportunistic invasive plant species, that's what they want. They want a big light gap in the forest. When those ash die in the numbers they did, it creates all these light gaps in our otherwise healthier forest. So it's just another vector for these invasive plant species to spread. And that's where a lot of our big shrub invasions that we're seeing have been caused by the holes in the forest that emerald ash borer has left. So we don't do a lot of management for emerald ash borer, but we're dealing with the consequences on a daily basis. Spotted lanternfly is one you may have heard of. That's early detection here in Western New York still, but something we're really concerned about. It feeds on a wide range of trees, especially maples and black walnut. It disrupts sap flow, and it also threatens a lot of agricultural plants. So it's a big deal. It's pretty well established in Pennsylvania and New York City. So we're keeping an eye out for that right now. It's something we're concerned about. Spongy moth and Asian longhorn beetle. Spongy moth, or gypsy moth, you may have heard of. It's a defoliation caterpillar. Has an outbreak every few years. It's really hard on oaks. Often doesn't kill them like some of these other pathogens, but it's something we keep an eye on, and it can stress the trees out and eventually kill them if there's a lot of eruptions over a decade or so. Asian longhorn beetle is one we also like to keep an eye out for. Fortunately, this one's not established. It's a big, scary beetle, leaves these huge exit holes. And the scary thing about the Asian longhorn beetle is it's not very selective with the trees that it predates on. So pretty much any hardwood tree is at risk when those guys are around. Luckily, they're not super established. All right, and the last challenge we'll talk about, the last kind of depressing thing before we talk about solutions, is deer overabundance. So this is another aspect of our Western New York ecology that is really dynamic and is something we really have to be concerned about as land managers. So deer overabundance is widely recognized alongside invasive species and climate change. It's one of the top 3 threats that's undermining our eastern forest regeneration. A prominent study in 2023 found that 27 in 39 U.S. national parks and forests are facing regeneration failure in the eastern U.S., and deer browsing was the strongest predictor of this failure. So what's happening is, I have on this slide, deer eat 7 pounds of vegetation a day, and we tend to think of deer as these graceful forest icons, which they are, and they are a native species, so they're acting invasively, but they are native. But the numbers we're seeing today, they're reshaping our forest floor. They're picky eaters. They're doing long-term damage that we can see. And they have all kinds of ecological impacts. So before we talk about kind of the main impacts that this deer overabundance issue is that we're managing, let's talk about how this happened. So this deer overpopulation, it wasn't always this way. Before European settlement, white-tailed deer populations were relatively low. And they were balanced by our much more stable ecosystem at the time, mainly being our apex predators are no longer on our Western New York landscape right now. So cougars and wolves existed at that time. We had lots of intact forest, but cougars and wolves were exterminated from our landscape, and they no longer exist. So the main predators, the main check on deer population naturally would have been those 2 species. They no longer exist, so that creates a lot of overpopulation. But there's also our land use that we have in Western New York. So that fragmented landscape I talked about, that's actually what deer love. So deer are not a deep forest species. If you went out to the Adirondacks right now and you measured deer density, it would be much, much lower than Western New York because it's all intact forest. Deer are not, they don't prefer intact forest. They actually prefer edge habitat and the islands that we create from development and agriculture. So we've created millions of miles of deer habitat, and we no longer have the natural predators for deer that were on the landscape, cougars and wolves. So that creates a serious problem. The main kind of devastating effect that this has is deer are really preventing our forest from regenerating adequately. So they're selective browsers, and they prefer the tender, high-nutrient native plants that they evolved to eat. So just like we talked about with exotic plants, they evolved in a different ecosystem. They had all these checks and balances. Well, deer are native, so they evolved with our native plants. So what they want to eat is our native plants. Well, when we have all these invasive plant species and deer are eating all the native plants, that massively exacerbates the amount of invasion created by the invasive plants because all their competition, which is already struggling to compete, is being browsed. So this is actually one of the most serious problems that we're facing right now in our region. A lot of plants that we want are disappearing, and deer are eating the ones that they're eating the ones we want, and they're leaving the ones we don't want. So if you have an acre property and half of it's a good native population, half of it's exotics, the deer eat half that acre of natives. They're leaving the door open for those exotic species to colonize what's left over. One of the kind of crazy facts I always like to mention about deer is one doe eats 7 pounds of vegetation a day. That comes out to 3,500 pounds of vegetation annually. Multiply that by 20 deer per square mile, which we're seeing 20 to 60 deer per square mile right now in Western New York. A good number per square mile would be 5, 10. We're seeing up to 60. It's not rare for me to have a game camera photo at one of our protected properties that has 30 deer in the frame. So that's 3,500 pounds of vegetation annually that one doe eats. If you multiply that by 20 deer per square mile, that's 70,000 pounds of plants every year in that 20 square mile range that deer are eating. So you can see the kind of uphill battle that we have trying to get our native understories reestablished. All right, so that was depressing. What do we do about it? So we talked about the challenges, invasive plants, pathogens, deer overabundance, and they all interact and exacerbate one another. So what do we do about this? That's what my job is, that's what my team's job is, and that's what we do a lot of thinking about here at the Land Conservancy. So how we address a lot of these biological and ecological challenges is through the art and science of restoration ecology. So restoration ecology is helping nature to recover using science and stewardship to bring damaged lands back to health. So when we talk about those invasive plants, we use restoration ecology projects to address those. When we talk about pests and pathogens, we use things like our HWA program. We use treatment methods for that, which also falls under the category of restoration ecology. And then deer overabundance, we'll talk about a deer management program that we run on our properties to try to stave off some of the main impacts that deer overabundance is having on our landscape. So first solution, we talked about the challenges. Here's an invasive plant project. So this is at our Marjorie Gallagly Nature Sanctuary in Grand Island, New York. So this is a project that was started in 2021. And half of this almost 200-acre preserve was a complete monoculture of common buckthorn, which is one of those really nasty shrubs we talked about. It was almost, we called it old growth buckthorn because they were massive stem. It's a shrub, but they looked like trees here. It was so pervasive. Millions of seeds being dropped every year by these mature buckthorn trees. So we had to figure out a way to remove that mass amount of biomass of this invasive shrub monoculture and make it more like the southern half of this property, which is actually beautiful, intact oak hickory forest. And there's this line in the sand that's, you could delineate those two habitat types from. So what we did at the Gallagly Nature Sanctuary is we used this scary-looking forestry mulcher to mow over the common buckthorn invasion. Once you do that, if it's in the winter or fall, you drip a small amount of chemical treatment on each of those stems. They suck it into their roots. It kills the plant. And then once that happens, so you remove all the biomass, you do that treatment, and then you take 2 more years of retreatments because all those plants are going to sprout up. They're root sprouters, so there's going to be all these buckthorn sprouts that come up. So this is a multi-year process. You retreat all those, and then eventually the key with managing these invasive plants is you need to remove them, so you need to remove them in the best way possible, for the best scientific management style possible. But then you also have to reestablish native plants and give them that competitive advantage that they're missing. Otherwise, all that's going to happen is you're going to take all this buckthorn out and it's going to come back because the seed banks have, 50 to 100 years of buckthorn sitting there. So that's really key. That reestablishment phase is really key. So you can see some of our native plant material in this pile here that all went in after those 3 rounds of treatment. So you can see a buckthorn thicket here on the left, and then what it looks like now. So you literally couldn't walk, couldn't see where you were. We removed all that biomass, a couple years of treatments, and then you can see all this beautiful, this is a native sedge that's coming up in the understory. All those fenced plants are different native trees and shrubs. So that's what Gallagly looks like now. So that's what we can do with restoration ecology. And this is just kind of one of the methods that we use, strategies that we implement to manage this invasive plant problem. So now let's talk about that challenge of pests and pathogens. So I mentioned the #1 concern on the Land Conservancy's docket right now is hemlock woolly adelgid. Hemlock woolly adelgid is that insect that eventually kills hemlocks, disrupts sap flow, it attacks the needles. And it's really nasty because it has 2 generations of these little insects that it creates. And the only way really that we can stave off this pest right now is these basil bark treatments. So we've been doing those. We have an active project that actually just finished phase 1 this year where we did basil bark treatments at 6 of our properties across Western New York. And you can see on the right applications happening. So that these applications will give 3 to 5 years of protection to these hemlock trees. I mentioned hemlocks were really important. We consider hemlock a keystone species here in Western New York. So they're really the main tree that provides a lot of structure in our otherwise hardwood forest. So they provide microclimates. They often grow in groves, like the one on this picture to the right. And those groves create microclimates and a bunch of different habitat niches that our hardwood trees don't create. So there can be up to 10 to 15 degree temperature swing when you're walking from a hemlock grove to a normal part of the deciduous forest, and that's something we see at this is our Mossy Point Preserve on the right. And often when we take hikes up there, you can feel that microclimate as you walk through this grove. So that's one of the reasons that hemlock is really important. is microclimate creation, and just that vertical and horizontal structure that it creates in otherwise deciduous hardwood forests. A lot of our wildlife are dependent on that structure. So things like fishers, all of our small mammals, gray fox, that structure is really crucial to them because we don't have it otherwise with our deciduous trees. So I also mentioned the water quality impacts of hemlock. They like ravines and riparian areas. They're often what holds these side slopes of these ravines together, and they provide shade over that waterway. So it creates better temperatures for fish, creates less erosion. So there's massive water quality impacts if we just all of a sudden lose all of our hemlocks, which is what we're looking at right now, and was what has already happened in parts of the southern part of the country. So this is our main concern in the pest world right now, and that's why we're doing this project to treat our hemlocks. Now, these treatments are not a permanent solution, unfortunately. Like I said, they give 3 to 5 years of protection. But we're going to be facing this problem for a long time. Now, fortunately, there is another solution to hemlock woolly adelgid, and that is a biocontrol. There's actually 2 that are being developed by New York State Hemlock Initiative and other partners across the country. But a biocontrol is different than these chemical treatments I've talked about so far. That's an actual organism that predates on the woolly adelgid insect. So there's a beetle and there's a silverfly. And the idea with biocontrols is you introduce them to the landscape, they naturally reproduce, and they control the unwanted invasive pest without any effort other than the actual reintroduction of them. So we're going through the process right now of reintroduction for what's called the Laricobius beetle, which predates on the first generation of the hemlock woolly adelgid. And we're in the early stages of trying to establish the silverfly biocontrol, which predates on the second generation. Tough thing about this insect is it has those 2 generations. So if you only predate on one, which the beetle's good at and is pretty well established, it's just going to come back the second part of the year. So this is really crucial because we kind of see these hemlock treatments as a stopgap measure to protect these trees while the biocontrol hopefully establishes. So that's kind of our philosophy behind this hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a really, really crucial problem we're facing in Western New York and throughout the Northeast right now. Okay, so the third challenge we talked about in stewardship and land management was that deer overabundance, which exacerbates the other 2. Solutions here, we run a deer management program. Any of those directly owned properties we have, our nature preserves, we generally have a hunting program. That's really the best you can do with deer right now. The key with our hunting program is we focus on harvesting female animals. So any sexually reproducing mammal, the best way to manage them is harvesting females. So we focus on that. And then we also just do mitigation. When we're doing our restoration ecology projects, Gallagly, which I talked about, we planted over 300 trees at. Every single one of those trees has to go in a cage. Any native planting you do, they're going to be eaten if they don't go in a cage. So between hunting and mitigation, that's kind of our best answer right now for deer management and that deer overabundance that we're facing. The other key with deer management, if you have your own private property you manage, is making sure that your property is not a haven property. So in the height of the hunting season, deer hunker down on properties that they're not getting pressured at. So even if our harvest numbers aren't doing a lot of damage or not doing a lot of population control, the fact that you're hunting or pressuring deer on a property is going to at least create a dynamic where they're not hunkered down and feeding the whole winter on a property where they're not hunted. So we try to do that at least. But yeah, this is a real challenge right now. It's more kind of high-level policy that is going to be real solutions to this issue. There are some avenues the Land Conservancy is exploring with Deer Management Assistance Program and some things through the state where we can harvest extra deer. But this is a real big problem that we're doing our best on, but it's a big challenge. So the last kind of part of land stewardship that I didn't talk about, we talked about kind of the ecological and biological challenges we're facing right now. Talked about a couple solutions and strategies to those. But there's also the whole abiotic or non-biological side of land management that we also do a lot of intentional thinking about. And our management ethic at the Land Conservancy is a little bit different from what you think of at a lot of other parks or public lands. We really try to put nature first when we're talking about things like public access and recreation. So we use sustainable trail design principles. So anytime we're opening a property to public for public access, we've done all that kind of restoration work, that vegetation survey work already. Now we're talking about opening up to the public. that we kind of think through are how can public access happen, but also keep the property on a positive trajectory ecologically. So all that restoration work we've done is all about altering trajectory, trying to make sure that the work we do is putting that property on a path that will eventually be a high quality, mature forest in the case of Western New York, because that's what most of our land wants to be. And we do the same type of thinking with sustainable trail design. So we really make sure that we site our public access, our kiosks, our parking lots, our trails in a way that's super low impact, and it puts the ecological and conservation values of the property first. And that just requires a lot of survey, a lot of making sure you know what you have, making sure sensitive plants, wildlife, habitats are being avoided. Oftentimes when we inherit a property, there's logging roads or previous impacts, so we want to utilize public access on previously impacted areas. We don't want to impact new areas when we're laying out trails and recreation opportunities. We have this kind of nature or kind of wildernessy style of management that all plays into. So just making sure those ecological values come first. If you've ever been to any of our preserves, dogs, ATVs, horses, we don't allow, because we're trying to be kind of that piece on the landscape where natural ecological values are put first before human and recreational uses. That said, we still offer those uses, and I think we do it in a really nice, balanced way. And that's about it. So we talked about challenges, we talked about some of our strategies. So hopefully that was interesting to you all, and I find it fascinating. I think it's really exciting and dynamic field, land management and stewardship. So hope you all enjoyed. Feel like I worked out.
We're going to ask people to come up to the mic, please, if you have questions.
Hello, talking about wildways. So generally when I drive south into Pennsylvania, you know, very large forest, the Allegheny National Forest and so on. Are you intentional of doing southern New York because it plays into Pennsylvania?
Definitely. So yeah, the Wildway is intentionally designed so that it plays into other landscape features outside of just our 8-county service area. So the Allegheny National Forest is very much a big core habitat source population that extends into Pennsylvania and beyond. So that's super important, yeah. And our Western New York Wildway, we think of as part of the overall Eastern Wildway, which is a wildlands network project that creates this huge wildway network across the entire eastern U.S. So our Western New York Wildway is just a piece of that greater Eastern Wildway. So it all plays together. So the idea is that north to south and east to west species movement can happen. So Adirondacks to Buffalo, Buffalo through the mid-Atlantic, allowing species to migrate across the landscape as they need to adapt, especially in the face of climate change.
Pixie Hamilton from Richmond, Virginia, and I want to thank you for your presentation. So I get super frustrated with invasive plants. Yep. I'm sure you do too.
Yes.
With the Master Naturalist Group down in Virginia. And it's really tedious, and it's generally a physical, manual labor kind of thing. Yep. And we'll do 400 yards in 4 hours, and I look at 5 more miles, right, of what we need to do. So I noticed with your mitigation, you also have physical removal. You went in with a machine, right?
Yep.
Are there any new, innovative, researchy type biocontrol things going on out there that are more accessible to take care of this problem?
Yeah, good question. It's definitely a frustrating issue. I think what we run into, which is kind of similar to what you described, is we'll do a bunch of restoration work, removal of invasive plants on our conservation lands, and then we get up to the property line that we conserved. So we remove all this buckthorn, and then we hit the property line, and the buckthorn is continuing. The buckthorn doesn't know it's not our property anymore. So we have that seed source still. That's really challenging, and that's why a lot of those plants I mentioned in the invasive shrubs and invasive forbs, it's really about management right now. It's really hard to get to true eradication. As far as biocontrols, the one that's really doing well right now is that Hemlock woolly adelgid beetle. And then there's that silverfly as well that's not doing as well yet, but we're really hopeful with those. For a lot of those common shrubs and plants, though, we don't have a biocontrol. It's more mechanical or chemical removal. The key is just when you're doing removal, making sure you're doing a type of removal that's not actually making the problem worse. Some of these plants actually respond really aggressively to being just, say, if you just chop them, they have these rhizomes, these energy stores that'll actually make them spread even worse. So a lot of the times you have to couple mechanical and chemical treatments to really get these species to go away, as well as then planting natives afterwards.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering where you get your funding and whether you partner or collaborate with larger organizations like the Nature Conservancy or the World Wildlife Fund.
Yeah, so we get our funding through a combination of grants, donations. So we do partnerships. So the Wildlands, that Eastern Wildway I described, that's a collaboration with the Wildlands Network. We've worked with Nature Conservancy on several projects, New York State DEC, New York State Parks. So we do have a lot of partners that we do land protection with.
So I live off the grounds, so this is focused more on the surrounding area. But obviously, like, you know, first of all, thanks for the great talk.
Yeah,
it's super interesting and great to hear all these things. So obviously, like, you know, citizens can support your initiatives through like donation or volunteering. And then I'm wondering also in terms of practicing like ecological restoration on your own properties, like what would you say like the most important steps or the best practices are for like that kind of ecological restoration on like your own properties that might be part of a fragmented landscape here?
Sure. So the work that you do on your private properties is just as important as the work we do at a larger scale on our conservation lands. I think the key is kind of what I just mentioned. There's a lot of information available out there about the best practices for that removal. So sometimes it's mechanical, sometimes there needs to be a chemical component. A lot of times if you're working on a smaller private property, you can get away with the mechanical treatment because you're there every day and you can keep pulling what comes up until, say, a rhizome is exhausted. So yeah, I think the key with doing stuff on your own private property is just making sure you have the information to ensure you're not exacerbating the problem and you're actually doing the removal properly. Western New York PRISM is one of our partner organizations actually that we work with all the time, and they have tons of great information on their website. So that's the Western New York Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. They have all kinds of information on those early detection species and then methods that you can do on your own private land to help control these things. PRISM. Yeah.
So it seems obviously you're trying to push the ecosystem back to the way it was 10, 20 years ago. How do you factor in changes in climate and also the coyotes that have now spread throughout the entire United States, bringing other things to the area?
Yeah, good question. So coyotes, I actually meant to mention in our deer overabundance discussion because they're kind of our last predator that has any impact on deer populations, and it's not much. So they predate on this time of year some fawns, but they're not big enough to predate on adult deer. So coyotes are considered a mesopredator, a medium-sized predator. They're really all about eating small mammals and rodents. So the expansion, the massive cosmopolitan expansion of coyotes over the last 20 to 50 years was mentioned. We don't really, if anything, we kind of see that as a good thing, especially with the predator gaps that we're having in our forest right now. So like that little bit of predation and pressure they put on white-tailed deer, I find to be really important. And I forgot the first part of your question. I think it was about, climate change. Yeah, so that's a really important thing when we're doing this land management. The main kind of factor that we consider with climate change and when we're doing these restoration projects is just when we're establishing those native species, once the invasives have been removed, we want to make sure we're not planting a species that is modeled to have is modeled to not be really populous in this region in the next 20 to 50 years. So we don't want to be planting a really northern cold-tolerant or cold-hardy species with these native installations if we know it's going to be warmer here. There's other groups and other styles where they really focus on those climate change models to select species. We kind of try to strike a balance between using a model to predict what's going to be here in the future, but also we're really using old-growth remnants to restore these properties as far as what we want to target. So we're kind of balancing that old-growth remnant with what climate change models are predicting when we select species.
for the work that you do. It's really great work. I have two quick questions. The first one, in planning the corridors, what are the priority species that you are planning for?
Good question. So some of the work we did was a wildlife movement analysis, and we wanted to use big mammals that have to move a lot in the landscape. So black bear are a species on our landscape that requires the biggest home range. So a female black bear needs at least a 10 square mile home range. So black bear, fisher, gray fox, red fox, bobcat were kind of the species we used for that wildlife movement analysis to help inform how big an area needs to be considered a core area. So 10 square miles is kind of a magic number for a lot of those mammals. So that's how we kind of factored in. Those are the species we use because they have to move the most.
Awesome. And secondly, you mentioned a couple of invasives and pests that you're tracking kind of early detection. Yeah. If someone here were to see one of those, is there a way that they can report it?
That is a fantastic question. So we have, it's called the IMAP Invasives website in New York State, and it's actually run by Western New York Prism, who I just mentioned. And that's an app that you can report invasive species sightings on. And when you do that, the Western New York Prism staff will actually come and vet that observation. And it's a really important community science way to find populations of these early detection plant species. So we have a species on our Mossy Point Preserve called Japanese stiltgrass, which is becoming a real problem. So that was actually found by IMAP Invasives detection. So really good question, and something we really encourage people to use is the IMAP Invasive Species app and website.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks again for your presentation. I also have two questions. One, what do you do with the invasive materials that you clear from land?
That's a great question. So depending on the plant, the question was about removing the actual biomass when we cut down invasives and remove them, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so that can be really critical. So a species like honeysuckle, which forms big thickets, if you leave honeysuckle stems on the ground and it gets moist, they can actually root and sprout from those cuttings. So we have to be really careful not to leave biomass on the landscape, depending on the species. So buckthorn's not as bad. We've done those big buckthorn treatments you saw photos of. That's not going to sprout from those cuttings or those removed stems. But we still generally chip them and remove them from the site so that they don't kind of fully shade out and smother the understory. But depending on the species, it can be either critically or just a nice thing to remove the biomass.
Okay. Second question. You talked a lot about the environmental challenges that you face. Would you like to comment on the political challenges you face?
It's challenging. That's all I got. Andrew, back there, our communications director, is giving me the cut.
I want to thank all of you for being here. And one of the things I always recall is that we are the most invasive species, and we have to be careful in what we do and the foot plant that we place on this wonderful place. But also, Caroline's here, and sometimes we really lose by losing. And when we started coming here, we had the wonderful little bats who didn't do quite as much about mosquitoes as we used to mythologically believe, but they did a lot. And sometimes the damage isn't from invasion, invasion is from subtraction. So we have to be careful. I really worry sometimes that we try so hard to not have invasive species that we're not taking care of just our own land around us. And I would rather have, I'm a bad person, I'd rather have controlled invasive species than everything going nuts. And that's hard to do. But one of the ways that we can help control these problems is encourage our youth to pay attention to science, to not believe all the crap about science is bad, but to actually study. And one of the things you can feel good about is that for the last 7 years, we have provided a scholarship to a leading science student at the Chautauqua Lake Central School, so that we now have 7 young people who are getting older who will be able to help pass this along. But to do that, we need you to donate a little bit of money on your way out. We have a basket. And then next week, we're going to do the science of comedy. And we have an improv troupe from Baltimore is going to be here. And they both have studied this, what makes people laugh and how that makes them feel better. And they will make us laugh. So we hope to see you next Tuesday. And it'll be cooler. I promise. Thank you.